Everybody, welcome to the channel. Today I have a 2013 Toyota Prius that has a blown head gasket. So I will be swapping this engine out with a JDM 1.8 liter Prius engine. Here are some of the tools that I will be using for this job. A heat gun is very important to have for loosening up all of the hoses. I've got two sets of pliers for the hose clamps. Then we have the standard set of sockets. So the first thing I'm going to do is go in the back of the car, remove all of the covers and plastics, and disconnect the hybrid battery and disconnect the 12-volt auxiliary battery. Now I do want to say that with this engine swap, I like to take the engine out from the top. That may not be the recommended way that's in the factory service manual. I believe they have you dropping the subframe with the engine from below the car, but I find that this method is easier, so that's the way I'm going to do it. I'll start off with removing the hood, 4 bolts, and don't forget to disconnect the windshield washer fluid line. Then just lift it out. It's pretty easy. It's made out of aluminum and very lightweight. Next, I'm going to remove the plastic around the cowl and the cowl assembly itself, along with the windshield wipers. Moving on to the air box, there are several screws on the top. Once you separate the air box assembly, you'll find additional screws inside. I'm going to go ahead and move to the bottom, remove that undercover, and then I'm going to loosen up the valve on the bottom of the radiator. That will allow me to drain the coolant. Now I'm going to move on to the AC compressor. It does have a big orange electrical connector on it. I'm not sure you actually have to disconnect it, but I did anyway. There's a little green tab that you have to pop up, and then you can press the orange tab and disconnect the two halves of the connector. Keep in mind, as I am removing the AC compressor bolts, there are two on the bottom and one on top of the compressor. We're not actually going to disconnect any AC lines. The compressor is gonna remain to the side and in the engine bay while the engine is being lifted out. Once the AC compressor is out of the way, I'm moving on to the main radiator coolant hoses. Again, using that heat gun to heat up the hose and twist it right off. Pretty easy to do on the passenger side. On the driver's side, it's a little bit more involved. There is a radiator hose going from the radiator to a metal coolant line, and then back to a small 3-inch hose from the metal line to the engine block. So I'm gonna go ahead and disconnect. Well, first I'm gonna go ahead and remove the bolts that hold the metal coolant line in place, and then disconnect the radiator hose. Here's that short 3-inch hose going from the metal coolant line to the engine block. Once that's out of the way, there are two more coolant hoses going from the EGR cooler to, I believe, the heater core, but I don't really have a good shot here. Instead, I'll show you where they connect on this replacement engine. And while I have you here, I want to point out this last electrical connector that's pretty easy to miss. That has to be unplugged before you can remove the engine. Next up is the fuel line. You have to remove this plastic bracket first and then push in the two yellow tabs on the fuel line connector. Here I'm going to twist the line a little bit as I'm pushing in those two tabs, and then I'll lift the line from the connector. Next up, I'm going to remove the coolant reservoir. That's got to come out so that I can get to the engine mount bolt and take off the engine mount. Next up on the list to disconnect is the exhaust system. You don't need to do anything with the exhaust manifold. All you need to do is remove these two bolts that hold the exhaust pipe to the exhaust manifold. And while I'm under here, I'm gonna go ahead and start removing the engine to the transmission bolts. A lot of them can be accessed from the bottom of the car. There are two more at the top of the engine that I can't get a good shot at. Instead, again, I'll show you on the replacement engine where those two bolts go. So here is the first one and the second one on the other side. Alright, before I can get to those two bolts, there's one more plastic bracket that's held in with this short bolt. Once that's loosened up, I'm gonna go ahead and take my 14mm socket and loosen up one of the two remaining engine to transmission bolts. Alright, that's one, and the last one you'll need a combination wrench, and you'll be able to access that bolt from the back of the engine. For the most part, I've got everything removed and disconnected. The last thing on the list is the engine mount. I have the jack underneath supporting the engine, and I'm going to remove all the bolts from the engine mount and take that engine mount out of the way. Now that I have the engine mount removed, I'm gonna go ahead and hook up my engine hoist. I'll use the engine mount bracket as the first point where I'll connect the hoist to. And then there's also a hole in the back of the cylinder head right here where you can hook up the other side of the engine hoist. I'm gonna go ahead and start lifting the engine out. Once I had this loosened up and hanging in the air, I did notice that I didn't really have enough room with the electric pump being in the way. I know I read on the forum some people took this engine out without removing the electrical pump. I couldn't do that, so I had to remove that to get more clearance. Alright, so now that the old engine is out, I did want to quickly go through several minor differences between the JDM engine and the American engine. The first one, actually the only one, is the purge valve and the purge line. So you can see the American engine has a larger diameter line, so I'm going to swap that from the old engine to this replacement JDM engine. The other thing is the fuel line. On the JDM engine they cut that out, so I'm gonna have to swap the fuel line from the old engine over to this replacement engine. Alright, the engine is now ready to be reinstalled. I'm not really going to go into covering all of the reinstallation steps. It's pretty straightforward. Just follow the process in the reverse order. Once I had everything back in place, connected and torqued down, I filled up the coolant. That was 1.5 gallons, and filled up the oil, and the car is ready to be tested. I did go and put the car into maintenance mode, and basically maintenance mode on a Prius allows the engine to run without relying on the hybrid battery. So you can run the engine for as long as you need to test it out, make sure it's broken in, make sure nothing is wrong. That will allow the engine to heat up, get the coolant circulating, which, by the way, I did have to add a little bit more coolant once the thermostat opened up and coolant was circulating through the whole engine. But that's it. Everything went smoothly. The replacement engine ran great. It was quiet, smooth, no issues at all. So that's it for this swap. I will see you guys in the next video.